going on, everybody? Let's learn about methods and functions today. Brace yourself. Incoming dad joke.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up variables and conditions and functions. Hey, if you didn't expect a conjunction junction joke at this point, I don't know what you expected, but either way, let's get straight into it. So let's go ahead and open up our Java folder. I'm going to right click it and open with Visual Studio Code. And we're going to make a new file. So I'm going to click the new file button and we're going to call this functions.java. Okay, so let's make our class. We're going to call this class functions with an open and close curly bracket. And then if you've made a main method with me before, go ahead and say it along with me. Public static void main string array args. And let's get into it. Okay, so one thing, and I have a confession to make, I've actually had you write functions and methods already in this class that we've been doing together. And the funny thing is, the main method is what you've been doing as a function. So remember how I told you we need our main method to drive our code? That's because the main method is going to run anything between these open and closed curly brackets that we have here. Another thing I want to call out too is you might hear me say function and method, and we're going to use those interchangeably. So whenever you hear me say function or method, just know they mean the same thing. And some languages call it function. Java happens to call this a method. So just know they're the same thing, and don't worry if you hear one or the other. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a basic function. So I'm going to write down some stuff and just follow along with me. We're going to go ahead and talk about it as we go. So we're going to write public void bark with an open and close parentheses and then an open and close curly bracket. Then we're going to do a quick system.out.println. So we'll say system.out.println, and we're just going to say bark with a semicolon at the end. This is a very basic function that we can write that whenever we call it is going to print bark, which is pretty cool. So let's say we can combine this with a for loop, and we could like loop over this function that we've done before and make it bark several times like a really annoying dog. But besides that point, let's look a little bit more at the function itself. So there's some stuff that you may have noticed before when we made our main method. Like you see some keywords in the front of every method that we have. So the first thing that you probably notice is this public. What does public mean? Well, there's some stuff that we're going to talk about later, like packages and things like that. But the key points to take away from the public keyword that you see in front of the method here is public means this method is accessible by virtually any code that we have outside of this functions class and its package, which we could talk about later. The next modifier that we can talk about is one called protected. So that package that we're talking about, protected, basically just says, hey, everything within this package can access this method here. And then finally, we have the one called private. And private basically says only things within the class functions can access this method. So basically, if we were to say private here instead, the only place that would be able to use this bark method would be between these curly brackets for the functions class. Now, if that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you, don't worry, there's going to be some videos that we'll do on that later. But just know that those are some keywords that you can see: public, protected, and private. Okay, so now you might be wondering what this void is. So you're saying this method is going to return nothing when you have a void in front of the method name. If I were to change this, so if I said string instead of void, all of a sudden, this method is going to need to return a string, which it currently is not doing. The way I could fix that would be doing something like this, return, and then we can make a string and say bark like that. And that would actually make this a valid string method. But there's other changes we could do too if we wanted to. Remember how we were working with arrays before? Well, we could do a string array return type, and then we would just simply need to make an array and return that. So that is basically what the function is actually trying to do when you see these keywords. So first, we have our public, protected, and private modifier. We then have our return type, and then we finally have our method name. Now, the method name is just the name of the method. Usually you want to be as descriptive as possible whenever you're making a method name. So in this one, since we're just barking, I'm just going to call this bark because that's what it's doing. Whenever I call bark, it barks. So it's a very good dog. But besides that, let's go ahead and change this back to void. And let's take away this return type, because since this is void, we do not need a return type. The last thing we're going to talk about is the parameters, which is what goes between the parentheses here. But don't worry, we'll talk about that in a second. Let's just see what this method does. So how can we make this method run in our main method? So what we want to do is create an instance of what we're going to call the functions object. So to make our instance, we're going to come into our main method, and then we're going to write functions, which is our class. And then we're just going to put the letter F, which is going to be our accessor for the functions object. Then we're going to say equals new functions, open and close parentheses, and a semicolon. Okay. So that might have been a little confusing, so let's kind of go through exactly what we just did. Inside of our main method, we're saying, hey, we have a functions class, and I want to have a separate instance of that class. Let's call this instance F. So that's why we're saying F is a new functions instance, and that's what we're saying here. So this is going to be our object, which is going to allow us to access everything within it. What do we have inside of our class? Well, we have a method called bark, and let's use it. So how do we access it? So how are we going to run this code? Really simple. We're simply going to say f.bark, semicolon after our two parentheses. Make sure that you save this. Now let's go ahead and open our command prompt. So I'm going to go ahead and cd to the desktop and my Java folder. And then we're going to compile. So we're going to say javac functions.java. It compiled successfully. So now let's go ahead and run it. Java functions. And as you can see, we got bark perfectly just as we expected. So that is one way that you can use this method. But now there's probably some other questions that you have. So let's go ahead and try to get through those too. The first thing that I want to bring up now is you probably noticed in the main method that there is another keyword, static. So what does static do? The complicated answer is static makes your function available at runtime, meaning that you don't have to do this new functions assignment to use it. That sounds really complicated. So let's actually show you what it does, and it'll make a lot more sense. So if I actually put public static void bark, then what I can do is erase this right here. I can get rid of the f dot because we no longer need it. And if I save this, let's go ahead and try to compile and run this again. So we're going to compile and run. And you can see that we got bark as well. So I know what you're thinking. Well, why don't we just say everything is static? Well, there's a problem with that. You can't make changes to a static function because a static function needs to be the same in order to be able to execute without any issues. If you ever need to make changes, by saying something is static, you're saying this is never going to change and we're never going to override it, basically. And don't worry about that term, overriding. That's going to be a term for later down the road. That is why you don't always want to make something static. Because what if you want different instances of it as well? So then that would be another reason why not to make it static. Because think of it like this. Since we're making a bark function, well, every dog has a different bark, right? So if we wanted, and I'm going to go ahead and back up a little bit by hitting Control Z a few times. If we wanted a couple of different dogs, what we could do is something like, say, instead of F, we can call this Fido. And then instead of just one dog, we could do a couple of different instances of dogs. So we can say Fido, and then in here, we can say Rover. And now we have two different instances of dogs. We can make Fido bark by saying Fido.bark. And he barked. Good dog. And then we can also make Rover bark by saying Rover.bark. And Rover would bark as well. If it still doesn't make sense to you, please feel free to leave a comment and I'll do my best to help you answer that question if you need it. There's a couple other things that I want to discuss as well. So the last thing that we really glossed over was the parentheses after the function name. This is where you can pass in variables into your function to make it do unique things. Remember how I have Fido and Rover? So let's make them do different barks because they're different dogs. What I'm going to do here inside of this method now, let's go ahead and get rid of this static because this is not going to be a static method. And we're going to go ahead and put a string here. So I'm going to click between the parentheses and I'm going to say string bark. So by doing this, I can pass this variable right here. And now this variable is going to print instead of whatever I had before. Let's go ahead and make Fido and Rover have different barks. Fido is actually going to bark normally, so we'll say bark the way we had before. But let's say Rover is more of a deep voice dog. He's gonna go roof. So we have bark and roof. So I'm gonna save this. And what do you think is gonna happen when we run it? Let's try it out. So I'm gonna go into my command prompt. We're gonna compile. No errors, which is good. Let's go ahead and run it. And we get bark and roof. Pretty cool, right? So that's another thing that you can do with functions is you can actually pass in variables to make the functions do different things. So now let's combine this with some of the stuff that we were doing before. So remember how we did for loops and while loops and stuff like that? Let's go ahead and set up a for loop. So I'm going to go ahead and erase all of this here. And then let's just keep Fido by itself. And then what we're going to do now, we're going to make a for loop. So I'm going to say for. And we're just going to do it the way we've done it in the simple version, which is int I equals 0. I is less than 5. I plus plus. And now what we could do is make Fido bark as many times as we would like. So I could say, in this instance, I could say Fido.bark. And then I can pass his bark in. So we'll say bark. And now this function, what do you think it's going to do? Is it going to print just bark? Is it going to print bark 5 times? Or is it going to print 0 through 5 for Fido? It's definitely not going to print 0 through 5. So let's just get that one out of the way. So let's go ahead and save this really quick. And let's run this. So we're going to go ahead and compile. And run. And you can see Fido was barking 5 times here. So that's another cool little way that we can combine this with some of the stuff that we've done before. So one thing that I challenge you to do is play around with if statements and other stuff as well. But the key takeaways as far as a function goes, so let's just quickly summarize. In the front, you're going to have your public, protected, or private, and that's going to let you know the level of protection that this method is going to have. Now, the public, protected, or private is not necessary, and if you leave it off, so if I actually took this off and just said void bark, then it's automatically protected. I know that's going to be kind of like a little weird things, but that's what it's going to be, is it'll be protected if you don't put it. Also, the return type is required, so you can't leave this off. The return type has to be there right before your method name. And then finally, static is going to be if you want to make the method static or not, and it's not required if you do not want your method to be static. One last thing to point out is, notice that we passed in a variable between the parentheses here. We can technically pass in as many variables as we would like. So I could put int ID number for, like, let's say the dog had a dog tag with an ID number on it. I could say something like Boolean is Fido, and then I can pass a true or false to let you know if it's Fido or not. So that way it does something different if it's Fido. There's so many different things you can do with methods. So one thing I encourage you to do after seeing this video, if you made this method, try adding as many different variables as you can and make this function do something different. And then even try to do maybe a different return type. So here, instead of doing something like void, let's go ahead and do string. And then let's just reduce this to bark. And I swear this will be the last thing. So if we say that we're going to return a string bark, instead of doing a system.out.print, what we would want to do is return bark the string. And actually, I'm not doing this even correctly myself. I can just return the variable I passed in, bark. So now by returning this, what I could do if I wanted to print it now, let's get rid of this for loop. And let's do a system.out.println, and then we're going to call our function fido.bark. Now you might be asking me, hey, you can pass a function to a print statement? And the answer is yes, you absolutely can. And the reason why is because this function is going to return a string. And since we know it's going to return a string, a print statement is going to allow us to use a function that returns the string. So all I have to do now is inside the parentheses for this bark function is pass his bark. So we'll say bark, save. Let's go ahead and run it. We're going to compile and run. And there it is right there. And you can see that we got bark. This was definitely a little bit more complex from the stuff that we've done before. If you need to watch this again, please feel free to watch it again. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. But other than that, I'm going to go ahead and pass this to Dino in the future. That's all we got for methods today. Be sure to pay attention to the next video where we're going to go over classes. There's going to be some stuff that we did in here that didn't quite make sense, but when you see the classes video, it'll make a lot more sense. So stay tuned for that next video. I really hope you enjoyed this. Other than that, I am DB. You are you. I don't know why I pointed at you super energetically. I'm sorry. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks, everybody. Peace out.